Really excited about we're being recorded. I'm excited about this one, talking about getting trust on tough topics. Katie is one of the organizers for this, so I think I will let her introduce it. I do just want to, because I have your attention, alert everyone to the March 18th Irma Live, which is our next one, which was Mike Trossis and Jen Humphrey helped organize. And that's going to be about engaging local communities in your research. So with that, I think I will let Katie take it away.
Great. Okay. I have to make sure I continue to let people in, but I can do that. Well, so nice to see everyone here today. Thanks for joining, and I hope you're all doing well. I'm really excited about today's topic. It was inspired by, honestly, I think the way a lot of these are inspired, which is questions I had. As many of you know, I kind of work in the climate communication space. So thinking a little bit about how do we do this work? How do we, tackle tough topics? And how do we use sort of evidence-based practices to do so and sort of expert-based practices to do so? So I'm really grateful for this lineup of speakers we have. And thank you to Mike and Kelly Christensen for helping round up this group rather. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three speakers and let them take it away. We're going to have each of them speak for about 5 or 7 minutes or so, and then I'll kick off with a couple questions and then open it up so we have plenty of time for your discussion also. Okay, so we have with us today Jennifer Carmen, PhD, who is Director of Survey Strategy at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, where she develops and supports survey research on public attitudes, behaviors, and policy support regarding climate change, both in the US and globally. Her research interests are at the intersection of climate change adaptation and human behavior, and she focuses on how people can both protect themselves and advance the common good in the face of increasing climate change impacts. Next, we're going to hear from Nikki McLaren, PhD, who's an assistant professor of public relations in the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon. Her research explores the cognitive and social determinants of health behaviors and examines how mediated messages can be constructed to facilitate successful persuasion and message engagement. And our third speaker will be Glenn Noack, PhD, who's the Jim Kennedy New Media Professor, as well as Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies, co-director of the Center for Health and Risk Communication, and Professor of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Georgia's Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication. I love all those titles. We work in academia, so we get it. Prior to joining the Grady faculty in January of 2013, he worked for 14 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and spent 6 years as Director of Media Relations at the CDC and 6 years as Communications Director for CDC's National Immunization Program. So, wow, I really feel honored to have you all here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to speak first.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is always the moment of truth where I share a screen and make sure that it works. Okay. So hopefully you're seeing my title slide.
Yes, looks good.
Yay. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Katie and Beth, for having me here today. And thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Jennifer Carmen, and I'm the Director of Survey Strategy at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And as mentioned, YPCCC conducts research on public beliefs, attitudes, policy support, and behaviors related to climate change in the US and around the world. I'll be focusing on our results from the US. I think that for these initial slides, I'm really just going to be providing a broad background on where the public is on climate change for us to build for our discussion. And so first I want to familiarize you with this study. If you don't know it, it's called Climate Change in the American Mind. I'll also be calling it CCAM. It's a twice yearly nationally representative survey in the United States that YPCCC has been running in partnership with George Mason University's Center for Climate Change Communication since 2008. And so this survey tracks variations in Americans' opinions about climate change over time and also by political party. And based on this study, we've developed many insights to inform climate communication in the US and beyond. One of the insight from this research that some of you may be familiar with, but some may be hearing for the first time, is called Global Warming Six Americas. And what's notable about this is that prior to this research, which is not led by me, but I get to present on it, is that prior to this, a lot of people thought there were only two Americas related to global warming, the people who are strongly believing and strongly dismissive. But that's not the case. While those two poles do exist, there's actually a lot of variation in between. So these are the current state of the global warming six Americas. We have the alarmed, the people who have the highest belief that global warming is happening, they're the most concerned, and they're the most motivated to act. This is 26% of the American population. Next, we have the concerned people who care about climate change, who support action, but aren't as active as or as willing to take action as the alarmed. That's 28% of the American population. We have the cautious people who think global warming is happening, but aren't really sure what we need to do about it and aren't really sure that it's human caused. That's 18% of the population. The disengaged, people who really don't have much of an opinion about climate change either way, who don't think about it, it's only 5%. And then on the other side, you have the doubtful, people who are not really sure that global warming is happening at all. If it is, it's probably not caused by humans. And that's 12% of the population. And then on the farthest side, you have the people, the dismissive, the people who have the lowest belief global warming is happening, least concerned, least motivated to take action, to take pro-climate action. And that's 10% of the population. And those are the people who say, global warming is a hoax and yada, yada, yada. And one thing you may notice here is that the alarmed is more than twice the size of the dismissive. And many people assume that these are roughly the same size, but that's actually not the case. And we haven't been finding that for quite some time as part of our survey. And there are reasons for that, and I will come back to that later. Another insight from this research is what we call the 5 facts and the 10 words for climate change communication. And so they're simple and straightforward. And so first is it's real. Climate change is happening. Second, it's us. That climate change is caused primarily by human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels. 3, it's bad. Climate change has real-world harms, especially for people. 4, scientists agree. There's wide scientific consensus, as I'm sure many of you know. More than 99% of climate scientists agree that climate change is just happening, and it's us, and that it's bad. And then the 5th point is that there's hope. And this is especially important for action. And it's not just conveying what's called constructive hope, acknowledgement that the problem is bad, but there are real world actions that people can take to make the problem better. One thing we also find with this research is that these different facts resonate more with different audiences. For the alarmed, for example, they're most likely to respond to messages related to there's hope because they're already on board with these first 4 messages. And this constructive hope, this feeling that taking action makes a difference, that's more the kind of messaging they respond to. Whereas for the doubtful and the dismissive, there actually are messages that they're responsive to, specifically the messaging related to scientists agree. There's been research that's found that messaging around the scientific consensus can be especially persuasive with these groups, especially in increasing their beliefs that it's real and it's us and it's bad. And as part of our climate change in the American mind study, we've actually tracked Americans' level of agreement with these 5 key messages. And in our most recent survey, we find that most Americans actually agree with all of them. And so in our most recent survey from just a couple of months ago, we found 72% of Americans agree that it's real. They say that global warming is happening. 58% say that it's bad, that global warming is caused primarily by human activities. Say that it's us that is caused primarily by human activities. 64% say that it's bad. 64% of Americans are worried about global warming. 57% say that scientists agree, that they agree that most scientists think global warming is happening. And 59% give reasons for hope, that they say that they feel a personal sense of responsibility to help reduce global warming. And more recent research has identified what we call a 6th key truth, which is particularly linked to action, which is the perception that others care. If the people who think that the people around them care are more likely to take action. Unlike these other 5 messages that we find, however, that most Americans don't agree with this. Instead, we find that only 38% of Americans say that their friends and family think that it's important to take action on global warming, even though, as I showed you on the previous slide, 59% of Americans personally think that it's important. So we're finding this gap between what people themselves think and what they think the people around them think. So what explains that? And one thing that we've identified in our research is that the one major reason is that most Americans don't talk about it. In fact, in our most recent CCAM study, we found that only 20% of Americans say that they talk about global warming with friends and family at least a few times a month. We also found that the percentage of people who say they hear about global warming in the media, actually, as of this most recent wave, in December of 2025, the percentage who say they hear about it in the media is the lowest that it's been in 10 years. So the result of all this is that even though the American public opinion actually looks like this, where a majority of Americans are alarmed or concerned, and they're more than twice the size of the doubtful and dismissive, that people tend to underestimate the percentage who are alarmed and concerned and overestimate the percentage who are dismissive. And this is in part because many people who are alarmed and concerned don't talk about it. On the flip side, dismissive messaging is loud, and especially on social media. Most dismissive, I should say, don't talk about global warming, but those who do talk about it a lot. And dismissive messaging is often funded by fossil fuel interests and amplified by fossil fuel interests. And so that means that we end up with a distorted view of what American public opinion actually looks like, which further intimidates people who are concerned into not talking about it. And part of what we try to do at YPCCC is correct that. Sorry, I think that I might have gone a little long. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that was terrific. Thanks so much, Jennifer. I think that helps give us a sort of a sense of like, who is our audience, when we're doing this communication, and what are maybe our perceptions or misperceptions of who we're actually talking to. So that's a great context. Thank you. Nikki, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can take it away.
Great. Okay. I will also try to be speedy, even though I'm cramming a lot in. Okay, so hi, I'm so happy to be here. My name is Nikki McLaren. Like was said, I am a assistant professor at the University of Oregon, and I'm also part of our Center for Science Communication Research here that focuses on science, climate, and health research and education. So I wanted to introduce a little bit about what I do because it helps set the context for where I'm approaching, trust and the communication of these health and science and climate change topics. And so I really see myself at the intersection of psychology, public health, and then media and communication studies. And I'm specifically, all of my research, if you look at it, can typically answer one of these questions that drives a lot of what I do, which is, what is driving health intentions? What is going on in people's brains? Is it risk? Is it norms? Is it attitudes that is primarily influencing their intentions to engage in a behavior or not? I then look at the specific influence of mass media to inform or educate or influence those health decisions and beliefs. And then based off that knowledge, right, everything that we know from that, can we construct messages that utilize those psychological mechanisms, that utilize the affordances or benefits of mass media to promote healthy outcomes? And I typically focus this on behaviors that there is a racial or ethnic disparity at play. So that certain racial groups or ethnic groups are disproportionately affected either in onset or in treatment. So I figured I'd kind of go through some studies really quickly to just let you see what this actually means. So one of those studies was right before the COVID-19 vaccine was available for the public. Me and some colleagues at Michigan State and Georgia State conducted a survey to look at how different groups of Americans were feeling about the vaccine, if they were intending to get the vaccine once it was available. This study was motivated by the extended parallel processing model. So that's what most of these top three variables, those mediator variables, threat appraisals, coping appraisals, and fear were coming from. But I'm going to focus more on this bottom variable of trust. And we were specifically looking at, did Black and African Americans feel differently compared to white Americans in intentions through these variables? And what we found was that for our Black participants, vaccine intention compared to white participants was primarily driven by coping appraisals and trust. And this bottom one was essentially that for our Black and African American participants, they tended to have less trust in the vaccine process and specifically the COVID-19 vaccine, which led to less vaccine intentions. And as part of this study, we also then were looking at, okay, so what is driving that trust? What is influencing their perceptions of the vaccine? And so we had them give some open-ended responses that we subsequently coded into these keywords. And here's just, a few that popped up. We then looked at whether certain keywords were used more or less by the different groups. And here's what we found was that for Black participants, they were much more likely to use the keyword of cure. So when they talked about the vaccine, they talked about it as a cure and also ineffective. Whereas for white participants, they typically talked about it using conspiracy beliefs. And these significantly predicted trust. So for our Black participants, if they were talking about vaccines as a cure, that positively predicted trust. And so an example quote would be, it will cure the disease. Ineffective negatively predicted trust. It won't be effective, which kind of makes sense. And then also for our white participants, if they reported conspiracy beliefs such as it's made by the evils, that also negatively predicted trust. And I wanted to point to this first one about the cure because this worried us a bit when we were looking at the data. There are some vaccines we know that can be administered post-infection once you've already contracted it, but a lot of them are not that way, right? The inoculation process is to do beforehand. And so we got worried that if that is a predominant belief and that ends up getting encouraged in vaccine communication, it could further hurt the trust, right, of what's going on. And in my head, and as I was thinking about this, why is this cure language being brought up so much, so prolifically amongst our participants? And that made me think of another study that I had done that looked at how television shows, and specifically medical dramas and medical comedies, any show really, though this content analysis looked at post-2000, was handling vaccine storylines. And one of the findings that I thought about, this was actually the exclusion criteria, so not part of the main study, but of the 102 episodes that mentioned vaccines in its post-2000, about 15% talked about vaccines as a cure to an infection or a disease versus something you take preventively. And when we were initially screening, we ended up only analyzing 51, talking about this potential misinformation being communicated. 17.6% of those episodes also use the vaccine autism link as justification for being vaccine hesitant or opposed, which is further promoting this as a potentially valid argument, right? Why parents might, or people generally, it wasn't specific to childhood vaccines, might be hesitant. And once again, I'm going to close up really quickly. This is important because I know from my own research that people trust popular mass media for health information, both actively when they search, but also passively. So this is from a survey that I'm currently analyzing, so not published yet, still, raw data. I asked people what type of media they can go and seek health information for. And you'll notice the internet, Facebook, and YouTube are the top chosen options, and entertainment media is not that far behind. I also conducted some qualitative research with 25 regular TV watchers, asking them about the information, the health and science information they see on TV in fictional shows. And one of the predominant themes was that they trust that information because, as this quote says, I don't think any show that's out today would give something that's not accurate. And that was specifically in context because of these fears of misinformation. A lot of the participants reported that the shows are not going to put out misinformation because if people act on that, if they think that's true, that makes the show liable for any action from that. So they have this high trust in entertainment media for disseminating health content. And so overall, what, I guess I'm trying to communicate through this 5 to 7 minutes is, as I think we all know because of the panel topic, right? Trust is important, but particularly among groups that have justified dis or mistrust of traditional health sources that we could go into. And when this is the case, I guess one of the arguments that a lot of my research is making is that we have to then look at non-traditional sources that people are getting their health information from. And where I focus a lot of that is the entertainment and social media. And so for us as researchers, I think it's going to be increasingly important to not only monitor what type of information they're getting from these sources so that we can help counteract or, correct some of these beliefs, but also for us to be present on those as well. Some other research that I have going on right now is I've looked at the mental health content on TikTok and YouTube, and of like the 200 videos that we pulled, only 11.2% were coming from medical professionals. So most of this is being communicated by those who don't have necessarily expertise in the area. And also with this, right, some of my other research in health-related illnesses from climate change in Arizona has found that, okay, if we're on these channels and we're trying to communicate, especially to these marginalized groups, I think the easy one is, oh, we'll just choose someone who looks like them, right, or matches their race. But what we're finding is it's actually this perceived cultural similarity that is more important. And so we did an experiment that kind of looked at race versus cultural similarity, and it was the cultural similarity. If they felt like that person embodied their culture specifically, that was important, which we're still, figuring out. Okay, that was a lot, so I hope I wasn't too late, but happy to answer questions afterwards.
Thank you so much. That was so great and a lot to dig into, and I'm sure might dovetail well with some the content Glenn is going to share. Maybe some of that vaccine trust info might resonate with your time in the CDC, Glenn. But I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
No, you're very right. So I thought I'd be a journalist, and so my roots are in journalism. I spent a lot of my undergraduate years writing newspaper articles. Spent a summer writing headlines, which who knew? I learned early on the strategies and techniques for clickbait and how to get people drawn into a story. And then I morphed into persuasive advertising and persuasive communications, and I came down to the University of Georgia in 1989 and almost immediately began doing projects with the Centers for Disease Control, and they were all in HIV/AIDS prevention. And many of the challenges you see today existed back then in terms of politics and how do you message and how do you reach audiences with specific messages without causing stigma and stereotyping. And then I left the University of Georgia in 1998 to become the first director of communications for the National Immunization Program. And I had the opportunity to build an office of communications from about one or two people to a full-fledged office. And when I arrived there, one of the things that was really quickly apparent was, and it was apparent in the job search, was that the scientists believed that they didn't need to communicate about vaccines, that vaccines spoke for themselves. And I think, one of the things that scientists run into problems when it comes to trust is this notion that people will trust them inherently, or what they're doing is so inherently and obviously beneficial, you should trust them. And what the scientists and doctors that I encountered early on who had that deep belief forgot was a couple of things, is that one, their experiences with vaccine preventable diseases were way different than lay people's experiences. Many of them had spent a considerable amount of time in the real world fighting polio and smallpox and measles. And so they had seen the effects of those vaccine preventable diseases at scale. The other thing that they mistook from a communications perspective was they would always tell me that vaccines spoke for themselves. And it turns out vaccines do not speak for themselves. Diseases speak for vaccines. And so it's a misnomer, and it's a wide-held misnomer that among many doctors and people who are involved in vaccines, that the benefits are so inherently obvious, they will speak for themselves. And as Nikki's presentation shows, a lot of hesitancy results from people being worried about new vaccines, people being not knowing about what's involved in testing the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, and the fact that vaccines are tested extensively both before and after licensure for safety, that they're constantly being examined, which with a lot of medicines, that's not the case. And it's definitely not the case with vitamins and supplements, which a lot of people have high levels of trust in. When I became director of media relations, and I probably learned this when I was director of communications at the immunization program, a lot of times scientists thought that you could trust them because they were all on the same page. And the reality is they're often not. They often have different methods, different assumptions, and they could take a same set of data and come to much different conclusions. The other thing that often affects trust is that conflict because it plays into what the media is interested in. I always told people who came to me as director of media relations and they wanted to get attention, I said, well, if you want me to get media attention and you want me to use conflict, controversy, disagreement, I can probably generate a fair amount of media attention. You take those things away and just make it that you should be interested in this because I'm interested in it. That's not a news story. And I think that's another thing that affects trust is when scientists and others engage with journalists and media outlets, their assumption is that what they find interesting is a story. And it's often not a story. It's more along the lines of a testimonial that what I'm doing is great. You ought to know about it. And if you know about it and you believe it's great, then you will support my recommendations. When you're dealing with journalists and media outlets, that's boring. And so I think a lot of us have struggled, including in the climate change sphere, that it's much easier for those who are opposed to vaccines, climate change actions, to take extreme positions, to not be anchored in science, to focus on generating tension, highlighting conflict. All those things work really well for the opposing sides in this. And it's much more difficult for those who work for government agencies, for universities, who have been trained in scientific methods. So some of the things that I learned when it comes to how do you foster trust when you're dealing with, people who are hesitant, reluctant, or opposed to you, you need to find meaningful common ground. I did a lot of meetings in communities with people who were opposed to vaccines, and I quickly learned the best way to try to manage the tension was to point out, I too am a parent. And like all parents, I'm concerned about my children. The scientists and doctors who walked into those meetings and started with, I'm an expert, and you should know I know more than you, whether they said that explicitly or implied it, it didn't go well. And so we often spend a lot of time teaching them to find the common ground. I think assumptions and expectations, you need to think about your audience's assumptions and expectations, and we often don't do that. We're so worried about knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. But assumptions and expectations matter, and often experts' assumptions are way different than lay people's assumptions. The word novelty, the word new in vaccines, I could put new in front of laundry detergent. People will go, I think I'll try it. I can put new in front of vaccines, and people take a step back and say it's novel. And so, cure, a good example. Vaccines don't cure. For most things, we don't have cures. Rather, we have effective treatments. And so, again, a lot of effort needs to be made thinking about what are the kinds of definitions that our audiences have for the words that we use, and are they the same as ours? And then listening and trying to find out what really is driving their lack of trust and lack of behavior. And I guess finally, when you're trying to build trust, it's your actions and the results that you get when those actions are implemented, more so than the words that you use. I'm a much better communicator if my challenge is to get people on board for a major tax decrease than I would be if I was a communicator trying to get people on board for a major tax increase. Because at the end of the day, for a lot of this, it's not the words, it's the actions that are being proposed. It's the recommendations we're making that are what people are responding to more so than our words. Our words definitely matter in terms of how we frame those things. But if you're trying to advocate for something that people perceive or believe is going to disrupt their lives, like perhaps in climate change, the actions that they would have to do, you're going to run up against a lot more resistance. So I will leave it at that. And I think I'm looking forward to, like everybody else, the questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Glenn, and to all of you for kind of setting the table for this discussion. I'll kick things off with one question. I know we already have a question in the chat too, and we'll open up after this. But I wanted to just have you talk a little bit about to this group here, right? We're research communities, mostly at higher ed institutions, some other institutions. We don't necessarily have many opportunities to sit in a room, right, with our audience and try to build trust through common ground in that way, in that one-on-one way, or, we're not on Netflix, in people's living rooms, providing great entertainment. So I'm curious if you can speak to kind of that challenge, right? Like how can folks in sort of a little bit more of a traditional, like mostly one way communications direction, right? Like we're producing content that is being received either by the media, by readers, by folks on social media. How or what are the strategies that we have to overcome that trust barrier? Yeah, Glenn, it looks like you might have a response for us. So why don't you get us
So,
started?
so I was just saying that, that was a real problem for us at CDC. And one of the ways we did it when we were talking with journalists or members of the public is trying to surface or think about what assumptions might people have about how we're explaining this. Will they understand it? Are we using terms and language that would resonate with them? I think oftentimes we spend so much time with the scientists that we think we know that, but thinking about it from, if I didn't understand it, nobody, a broader audience, a lay audience won't understand it. So I think spending time thinking about, what are the assumptions, and then trying to come up with analogies and examples that would work well. I mean, it's like the term science. I think that COVID surfaced the fact that scientists and a lot of us who work with scientists have much different definitions of science than most lay audiences. We know that science is evolving, it's changing, there are different methods or disagreement among experts. What lay people think is that science is consistency, that there's agreement, there's consensus. And when you take, all like university magazines, I mean, people would say, not necessarily citing university magazines, but they'll be like, some studies say that coffee is safe and other studies say coffee causes cancer. And so scientists don't know anything. And so I think it's, recognizing that when we put information out, it may be inconsistent with what people have seen previously. It may be inconsistent with their lives. And then thinking about just simple, the words that we're using, not just are they, at an eighth grade reading level, but will they be interpreted the way that we intend them to? Like in the world of vaccines, the word new or the word safe, those are eighth grade reading level words. But I guarantee you that lay audiences and experts have far different meanings, depending on whether you're talking climate change or vaccines, for what safe means and what effective means. So I think I would say thinking about it in those terms.
That's great. Jennifer, Nikki, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts. One was just when you mentioned like how do we bridge the fact that as academics we don't meet with people, I wanted to kind of push back against that a little bit and think about maybe as academics that's something we should consider doing a little more. And I know that you mentioned that you have an upcoming panel on engaged research, which is in research that does involve direct engagement with communities and with community organizations and talking with people and listening to their concerns. And so I think one thing that I think as academics we need to do is to kind of question that model that we as academics produce the knowledge that we then provide outward. Like I think that's not the way that people work. And so thinking about what is it that we can gain and how is it that you can create exchange with people who are part of your audience, I think is important. And so, but the other piece, and I think this is something, but the other piece that, I recognize that as academics, we're incredibly busy and you can't be everywhere all at once. One thing to think about is the role of mediators. I think that, I can't remember if Nikki or Glenn used this term specifically, but the role of trusted messengers. A lot of the most effective climate communicators work with trusted messengers because there are a lot of people whose job is communication specifically, and you can build relationships with those people. And you tell two friends and they too tell two friends, and it expands out to their own networks. And but there are people who already exist in the communities and the audiences that you want to work with who are already trusted, and thinking about how to engage those. Like one person that Glenn mentioned before we got onto this call, that he's working with somebody who does weathercasting. And that's something that actually at the George Mason Center for Climate Communication, they have a center called Climate Matters that specifically engages weathercasters, who are one of the key trusted messengers on climate change. And so thinking about who are those people, without necessarily putting the entire burden on yourself of being the communicator, because no single person is going to be the one who's going to change everyone's mind.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly to everything said. I think when I think about how do we get our message out there, especially with this one-way communication where in the kind of the sea of chaos. I mean, coming as a PR professor, so I literally talk with my students on a weekly basis of, right, usually more for corporate communication, but it's the same challenge, right, with all of this information and there's so much. And what I always think about that applies to my own research, especially when I'm doing more applied research, is there's three questions I always ask is what do we want to tell the audience? What do we need to tell the audience? But then what does the audience want to know? And I think it's that third question that often gets lost. Like we get so caught up on what we think they need to hear that we don't actually think about what do people who are thinking about this behavior, who are thinking, especially these information seekers, what are the questions they're going to ask? What do they want to know? And can we be the source that provides it for them? And so utilizing a lot of, the strategic communication, PR knowledge, right, of thinking about how as silly it is, SEO, right? Are we using keywords or questions that they would be looking for? Are we not only doing formative research and asking them, but also like monitoring trends, like going to Answer the Public or Google Trends, especially if some health topic or science topic is trending. Like, what are the questions that people have, and let's put our content there so that they can access it easily, and putting it on that landing page and directing that traffic to us. And I'm sorry that was very stratcommy of me, but I try to like merge my two because my professional background is in strategic communication and PR, and so I'm like constantly trying to merge those two worlds for me.
Well, you're in the right room for that. We're here for it, I think. Um, yeah, it's interesting. In my office, we produced a piece on fast fashion, like the environmental impact of fast fashion, just as sort of as an explainer. And it was by far the most visited page, like anywhere on our site. And I think it was just because not that many pieces have been written about the environmental impact of fast fashion, and it was like meeting this need. And it continues to just like drive traffic like 3 years later. So it's interesting to think about from that perspective, like looking at Google Trends and seeing where the questions are being asked and how to meet that need. I want to look to the chat because I think the question from Christina kind of gets at a little bit of what Glenn was talking about in terms of, what scientists think is interesting and important to communicate may not always be interpreted in the same way by a lay audience. So this is a question about, perhaps was there too much communicated about the whole vaccine development process throughout, like, right, that 2020 year where we were all sort of, I mean, we meaning like science interested people, maybe were like waiting with bated breath on that sort of that vaccine development. But if folks who may not have been as sort of informed or sort of touched into that process, may have interpreted it differently. Like, why is this happening so fast? So anyway, Glenn, I don't know if you have something to say to that, or welcome anything from Nikki and Jennifer as well.
So sure. So I mean, I think that whole experience illustrated a couple of things that I think are really important. I mean, first of all, warp speed, Operation Warp Speed. One of the things that often happens in our world of communications is non-communications people take the lead, and then then you're playing catch up, and you can't undo what they have done. And so a lot of scientists and a lot of experts are driven by they think they know communication, so they're like, wow, let's give this a great name, Operation Warp Speed. It'll convey that we're taking this seriously, without any thought about what other interpretations might result, right? Then early on in COVID, there was a desire to try to increase vaccination by making a promise that probably should never have been made, which was that this vaccine will play a major role in stopping transmission of this virus. And I saw that at CDC with flu vaccine, that people wanted that flu vaccine to be more powerful than it really was. I mean, both the COVID vaccine and the influenza vaccines are designed first and foremost to protect people from getting seriously ill from influenza. And we learned pretty early in the influenza vaccination world that that promise, or whether it was implied or stated, that this would help protect other people, often led people to be disappointed that that didn't happen. And when you told them that if you got the vaccine, they wouldn't get the flu, they were often disappointed because they got the flu. And so even if the symptoms were mild, which is what the vaccine really was intended to do, they were disappointed because they got the flu. And they thought, well, this vaccine's useless because it doesn't prevent me from getting the flu. And I think COVID fell into that same trap. Very early on, there was tight discipline about the messaging, what that vaccine could do, but then it slipped as people wanted to become more persuasive and give the vaccine, imbue it with more benefits than it really had. And then they were shocked and disappointed when people recognized it couldn't do those things. So I think, and then I think going back to what Jennifer illustrated, I mean, she had the Six Americas. There's a lot of research in the vaccine world that suggests the same thing. I mean, there are people who are adamantly opposed to vaccines, people who like vaccines, and then there are these different bubbles in the middle. And when you're talking about vaccines, you really have to think about, who am I talking to? The hardest audience to persuade and change their mind are going to be those people who are dismissive, because they don't care enough to listen to you. And they definitely don't want to change their mind because they're going to deal with cognitive dissonance, which they don't want to deal with. So we often worried about the people who are on the fence and what would it take to get them to stay on our side. What did they have to hear? What were their questions? What were their concerns? And so I think it all begins with thinking like that versus, what's a one size fits all message strategy? Because for most topics, that really doesn't exist.
Nikki or Jennifer, anything else? Okay. I know there's another question from Allison in the chat about climate change and just how are you finding climate change messaging changing with current government policies? I'll look to you, Jennifer, maybe take a first stab at that.
Yeah, it's hard to answer this in a way that's not just like a bummer. So because 2025 was a very difficult, really just, I mean, you working in public health, is very like we're on parallel paths here. One thing I've really appreciated about this whole discussion is hearing how much overlap there is between the experiences and knowledge that we have in our worlds. But in this particular experience, the just rollback and all of the things like the fire hose of bad stuff that has been happening with the climate movement in the last year, it's been really difficult. As I mentioned in my slides, kind of offhand, there's been a lot less talk about climate. And there's been discussion within the climate movement of whether we should even say the words climate change anymore. One piece of wisdom, like one piece of conventional wisdom that emerged out of the 2024 election is that climate is a political loser, is that's why Harris lost, even though there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that. And in fact, our research since then has found that Americans' attitudes regarding climate change have not changed at all since before the election. People are just as worried as they were. The thing that's changed is how often they're hearing about it in the media. As I mentioned, we've been asking this question since 2015, and it's at the lowest levels that it's been since then. And so and part of it is this sort of, what the term that we use is the spiral of silence, that people don't hear about climate change. So they think nobody else cares. So they don't talk about it. So nobody else hears about it. And they also think that nobody else cares. And I think that phenomenon that's been discussed I can't remember if I said it, it's called climate hushing, is the discussion that's happening within the movement, this potential of whether we should do that, whether we should talk about other issues and not link them to climate change. That's been the big debate. Our organization has been pushing hard against that because we think that it's missing out on all of the ways that climate change is doing real harm to people. And especially among people who care. They still care. There's no reason not to talk about climate change among people. Like the people who were dismissive are still dismissive, but everybody else who cares still cares. And so there's no reason to avoid talking about climate change. So that's been the debate that we've been having over the last year. But I think that it's something that's changing really fast too, I would say. I'm really curious. I mean, like, curious is such an academic way of putting it, but I'm this how things are going to shape up this year, especially after the midterms, just because there's been so much that we've been put on the back foot on, that it feels like people are starting to fight back. And there are also, like, certainly messages that are being linked to, like, that are being brought up, that are also linked to climate. One is especially affordability. There's been a lot of discussion within the climate movement of how climate is an affordability issue, because that one challenge of talking about climate change is the abstractness that a lot of people think of it in terms of their impacts on people's lives. But we're increasingly finding climate change has a lot of direct impacts on people's lives and the cost of living, and communicating that, especially, I think, I'm hoping that's something we would like for campaigns to pick up more as a talking point. But mostly we just want people to talk about it more, because we're all experiencing climate change all the time.
Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone in the room is welcome to, like, raise their hand and ask their question aloud, but also the chat is fine. I see a question from Michelle. Do you want to say your question out loud, Michelle? Or I can read it. Well, the question is sort of picking up, Jennifer, where you left off a little bit, but just about, maybe it being a little bit surprising, right, to hear, and sort of unexpected to hear that actually people are still very concerned, or majority of folks are concerned about climate, and that just the reporting of that has not been shared as much. And so any strategies or ideas about how to even just convey that as a message?
So I'm going to quote Katharine Hayhoe, one of the top climate communicators out there. She's a biologist, I think, out of Texas Tech. Her quote is, "The most important action that you can take on climate change is to talk about it." And so that's the thing that I always tell people too, is talking to people in your lives, having those conversations with people. I think that in terms of how to get it out there more beyond that, I think it depends on your own sphere of influence, right? Like, we talk, like, at YPCCC, we talk to journalists and we try to get them to talk about climate change. If that's something that's in your power to do, then that should be like, but, as I mentioned, the Mason 4C has the Climate Matters, talking with weathercasters. There are other groups that talk with screenwriters. Like, to Nikki's presentation, there are climate orgs that talk with screenwriters to try to get them to write climate content into, or to try to train them on how to write climate content into scripts and things like that. So I think that it really comes down to, like, who do you think you are a trusted messenger for? Who do you think will listen to you when you talk about climate? And just talk to them.
Well, I would just say that, one of the things we learned in the world of vaccines is that I think it's easier, as Jennifer alluded to, that for some groups, it's easier to equip them to have those conversations, like meteorologists. We spent a lot of time, and it took us a while to learn it, that we would tell pediatricians and family practitioners and doctors and nurses to talk to your patients about vaccines. And that got us two responses. Well, of course, we don't really have a choice when they ask us questions, but that's not the issue. The issue is, how do we answer questions that are difficult to answer, questions that we had never thought about? How do we talk about and frame vaccines? And so we learned that we had to go basically from telling people to just talk about it to, first step was to figure out what questions that they were being asked that they had a difficult time answering. And then we had to get into doing script writing. which involved, doing research to find out, did this resonate? Is this understandable? Talking to parents who are raising those questions. So it's harder with a broader audience because, and then there were some projects that took place in the communities where some organizations said, we're going to teach parents to talk to other parents. The first reaction from parents who were supportive of vaccines was not me. I don't need to be arguing with another parent. I don't see why that would be a useful a use of my time that would be valuable. So it was really difficult. There were some efforts that were undertaken to try to equip parents to have difficult conversations with other parents, but ultimately they didn't take because parents didn't like conflict. They didn't like trying to persuade other parents because there was no benefit to them. I mean, they got their kids vaccinated, and it was kind of like, it's not my job to help you get their kids vaccinated. So I think it works well with, if you're teaching meteorologists how to talk about climate change, if you're teaching pediatricians how to talk about new vaccines. But I think it doesn't work as well as people imagine when you're trying to say, how do you get people to talk to other people about a topic that is often emotionally charged, politically laden, and gets into ideologies.
I think I would just add that made me think of a lot of my research related to vaccines, but also heat-related illness and other in mental health is the importance to not also villainize that people have questions. I think we see that a lot with vaccine work, like anti-vaxxers, and but as Glenn noted, like a lot of campaigns are to talk to those who are hesitant, and I think there's a justified reason why people are hesitant, right? This is a lot of information that they're not trained on, that they don't know about. These science terms are coming to them, and they a lot of times don't have the knowledge to understand what that means. And I think sometimes when messages come across too strong as like, if you use a straw, you don't care about the turtles, like you are anti-climate, or if you have questions for your doctor about how fast those childhood vaccine schedules are, right? That is not a bad thing. And so with communication, right, giving a clear call to action, telling them the small steps they can do in a way that's not, yeah, villainizing them. And that's hard, but it's something I try to always think of.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions from the group? I can keep us going with another question I have waiting. In the meantime, I was wondering, for some of you, this is your academic area of work, right? To study sort of messaging effectiveness and sort of what the temperature is out there for some of the messages that are coming from various sources. And I'm just wondering, for this group of research communicators, do you have ideas or strategies for kind of keeping up with these best practices that you may be coming up with in your research? And how do you think that how do we measure the effectiveness of the messages that we're getting out there? So kind of a two-part question. Feel free to tackle either arm of that.
I think I'd put less emphasis on the second part of it, of measuring the effectiveness, because again, it all depends about the audience. And most messages don't have powerful effects. I mean, a lot of we come to hold beliefs over time. And we get messages, the same messages from different people. They're worded and phrased in different ways. So the notion that we should try to, trace back where the persuasive influence was, or did that particular article impact a lot of people, that's just a lot of work and a lot of expense. And I just don't know that's really worth it. There's been a lot of great work done. I think at University of Florida, they have a Center for Public Interest Communications where they do spend a lot of time trying to figure out how can we make academic research, scholarly research more user-friendly for people who are, working for advocacy groups or other entities. And I've really admired a lot of the things that they have published because it's like, wow, it makes it seem so usable. So I think it's, part of it's on us as academics to figure out how we can make our research more accessible to those who are trying to persuade people or trying to better inform people or help people make better decision making. I think that's where I would put the effort rather than trying to figure out, did that article in the last issue have an effect? Because at the end of the day, even with social media, I always remind my student, there are 500 million tweets that go out every week. And good luck trying to measure. I can tell you, in fact, but the effectiveness of most of them, it's none.
Yeah, I go to where the people who are communicating are. I was like a graduate student, and this moment has always stuck with me where I was at a conference and it was a journalism specific session. And I remember it was a panel, and at some point, there was not an argument, but there was definitely a discussion of you had all these journalism researchers, and then you had a whole bunch of journalists. And the question got like, do the journalists ever read journalism research? And they were going, no, like, what are you talking about? We're way too busy. Because I think the expectation for researchers is that they'll come to us, where in reality we need to go to them, and to meet them where they are at, and whether that's industry conferences, right? Or like reaching out and being a part of the like there's so many organizations everywhere, right? That you could be a part of to help communicate with. And I think to Glenn's point, that also means like meeting our audience where they're at. I just wanted to share, there was this really cool, I was just talking to one of my colleagues, Deepu Murthy, who's in the psychology department at University of Oregon. And he was talking about this initiative he did in Philadelphia, where to help make brain science more accessible, they had events where it's like communication on tap or science on tap, similar to that, if you're familiar with that. But instead of just researchers going and talking about their research, they had improv comedians come. And so they would do an interview with two scientists about their research. And then the improv comedians would then do skits based off of that research. And it was just kind of an additional way to make it accessible without just us talking about it. And towards the end, they were selling out theaters, right? Because people were so interested in this event that was accessible because it was comedy, right? And so I think that's just a small example of ways that we can make it accessible without, just spewing at them what we do.
Jennifer, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I thought that was a really interesting response to that, because I think that what we've been finding similar, even to what Glenn was saying about the effectiveness and the measurement of effectiveness. I think that that's like the cutting edge of research in climate communications. It's actually, we're finding pretty similar results. I think that part of it is also, but I also don't want to like promote despair that like your communications can't work, because I think that you also, what really is that you need to be is that methods, there's not a one size fits all answer to this question, because I think that and this is kind of related to what we've been talking about. First, you have to think about who you want to reach. You have to think about how you want to reach them, and what they already know and who they are, but also what is it that you want from this particular communications, because that's what the methods are tailored to that. Like, and yeah, especially social media messaging, there is increasing evidence that social media messaging, the results don't really necessarily last. It has to be something that's repeated messages coming from trusted messengers. And but also maybe that's not the only way to communicate. Like, communication is what is it you want to say, who do you want to say it to, and how do you want to say it, and what is it that you want? And so and social media is one way to do it. Engage and like talking to people and going out into the world, that's another way to do it. And so but I think that also having a clear idea of what is it that you want from this can also help you measure effectiveness in a better way.
That's great. Well, there was a question in the chat. I know we're at 3 o'clock about how to survive the zombie apocalypse. Glenn, I don't know if you can summarize that in 30 seconds for us. What is that and why it was effective? Because I'm really dying to know, and then we'll have to
Well, yeah,
wrap up.
and I think the answer builds off what Jennifer just said. It was because entertainment education, people don't, if you engage them with the entertainment part, they're less likely to counter argue about the factual stuff that you're trying to convey. Now, it's really hard to do it well. And that one worked because, again, it was unexpected, it was novel, it was new. And so you have that going for you, but that's why I think it's really, we often do try to build entertainment or use entertainment education as a platform, because we know that when it works, it can work really well because people are getting caught up in the storyline and they don't get caught up in arguing about, the scientific facts that are kind of put in there, or the policy position. So it's another tool, another way to make the messages more effective.
Excellent. Well, that's a good place to end. Thank you so much to Jennifer, Nikki, and Glenn for joining us today. And thanks for everyone for attending and your great questions and engagement. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. We'll circulate that too. But appreciate your time and have a wonderful rest of your day and hopefully see you here in 1 month, March 18th, for our next Irma Live. All right. Take care,
Thank you.
everyone.